Hey guys, tonight you are not settling into the warm, comforting glow of the little house on the prairie that generations of Americans grew up cherishing, where Pa's fiddle fills the cabin with music and Ma's bread rises golden in the oven, and three little girls in calico dresses live out their pioneer childhood in a world of simple hardships and simpler triumphs. You're opening a book published in 1935 by Harper and Brothers. You're holding a children's novel written by a 68-year-old woman named Laura Ingalls Wilder, who desperately needed money during the Great Depression. And you are reading a sentence on page 3 that will teach millions of American children that Native Americans are not human beings. The sentence reads, "There were no people, only Indians lived there." You need to sit with those words for a moment. You need to understand what they are saying. Not what Laura Ingalls Wilder claimed they meant when a furious reader finally complained 17 years later. Not what modern defenders argue she intended. What the words actually say, in plain English, to a child reading them for the first time. There were no people. Only Indians lived there. The sentence structure is deliberate. The logic is explicit. The division is absolute. People exist in one category. Indians exist in another category. And those two categories do not overlap. Indians are not people. This is not ambiguous. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a declarative statement that places indigenous peoples outside the boundaries of humanity, that erases their personhood with the casual efficiency of a single sentence, that teaches children to see Native Americans as something other than human, something less than human, something that does not count when you are tallying up whether people live in a place or not. You are holding this book in your hands, Little House on the Prairie, the third volume in a series that will sell more than 60 million copies worldwide, that will be translated into 40 languages, that will be taught in elementary schools across America for generations, that will shape how countless children understand westward expansion and frontier history, and the relationship between white settlers and indigenous peoples. And this sentence, this single sentence that denies the humanity of Native Americans, is on page 3. It is not buried deep in the text. It is not a minor detail that casual readers might miss. It is the foundational premise of the entire book, the ideological framework that supports everything that follows, the thesis statement that justifies the Ingalls family's presence on Osage land by declaring that no people lived there before they arrived. You need to know that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote this sentence in the early 1930s, sitting at her desk at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, more than 60 years after the events she was describing. She was not a child recording her innocent perceptions. She was an elderly woman making conscious choices about how to tell a story, what language to use, what messages to send to young readers. She wrote that sentence with full adult awareness. She chose those words. She structured that sentence to create exactly the meaning it conveys, and you need to know that when her daughter Rose Wilder Lane read the manuscript, when the editors at Harper and Brothers reviewed it for publication, when the book went through multiple rounds of editing and revision before it appeared in bookstores in 1935, nobody questioned that sentence. Nobody suggested changing it. Nobody pointed out that it explicitly denies the humanity of indigenous peoples. The sentence survived every level of editorial review because everyone involved in producing the book either agreed with its premise or did not consider it problematic enough to warrant revision. The book was published. It became a bestseller. It was read by millions of children, and for 17 years that sentence stood unchallenged in print, teaching generation after generation of young Americans that Indians were not people, that their presence on the land did not count, that white settlers could claim territory was empty even when indigenous nations lived there, because indigenous peoples did not qualify as people in the first place. 17 years. Think about that. 17 years of children reading that sentence, absorbing that lesson, internalizing that hierarchy. 17 years before anyone objected loudly enough that the publisher paid attention. 17 years before Laura Ingalls Wilder was forced to confront what she had written and offer an explanation. And when that moment finally came, when a reader wrote an angry letter to Ursula Nordstrom at Harper & Row in 1952, when Nordstrom contacted Wilder and pointed out the problem with the sentence, Laura Ingalls Wilder's response was not an apology. It was not a recognition that the sentence expressed a genocidal ideology. It was not an acknowledgement that her words had caused harm to Indigenous readers or had perpetuated racism against Native Americans. Her response was, "It was a stupid blunder of mine. Of course, Indians are people, and I did not intend to imply they were not." A stupid blunder, as if the sentence had been a typo, an accidental grammatical error, a slip of the pen rather than a deliberate expression of the worldview that had shaped her entire childhood, that had justified her family's illegal occupation of Osage territory, that had allowed white settlers to convince themselves that they were pioneering empty land rather than stealing inhabited territory from sovereign nations who had lived there for generations. The sentence was eventually changed. In 1953, Harper and Row issued new editions with a revised version that read, "There were no settlers, only Indians lived there." But you need to understand what this revision does and does not do. It removes the explicit statement that Indians are not people, but it still implies that Indians are not settlers, not legitimate inhabitants, not rightful occupants of the land. It still creates a hierarchy where white people are settlers, a term that suggests intention and purpose and right, while Indians are simply there, a term that suggests accident, transience, lack of claim. The revision softens the racism. It does not eliminate it. And the revision came 17 years too late for the millions of children who had already read the original sentence. 17 years too late for the Native American children who had been forced to read a book that declared their ancestors were not people. 17 years too late to undo the damage that the sentence had caused, the ideology it had spread, the worldview it had reinforced. You close the book, you set it down, and you understand that what you have just read is not simply an unfortunate phrase from a different era. It is evidence of something larger, something more systematic, something that goes to the heart of how America has remembered its own history, how it has justified its expansion, how it has taught children to accept the dispossession of indigenous peoples as a natural and necessary part of the nation's development. The line that said Indians weren't people is your entry point into this story. But the full story is much longer, much more complicated, and much more disturbing than a single sentence can convey. And you're about to learn exactly what Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote, what she deleted, what she defended, and why it matters that we finally confront the racism that shaped one of America's most beloved children's book series. You're a 5-year-old child in 1940, sitting in your elementary school classroom somewhere in Wisconsin or Iowa or Minnesota, one of those small towns where everyone knows everyone, and the library has 3 shelves of children's books, and your teacher, Miss Anderson, has just announced that she's going to read aloud from a new book called Little House on the Prairie. You are excited. You love story time. You love the way Miss Anderson's voice changes when she reads different characters, the way she makes the stories come alive, the way the whole classroom gets quiet and everyone leans forward to listen. This book is about a family who lived on the prairie a long time ago, Miss Anderson explains. A family with 3 daughters, just like some of you. A family who built a house and planted crops and survived all sorts of adventures in a time when America was still being settled. She begins to read. A long time ago, when all the grandfathers and grandmothers of today were little boys and little girls or very small babies, or perhaps not even born. Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura and baby Carrie left their little house in the big woods of Wisconsin. Her voice is warm and inviting. You picture the family in their covered wagon, heading west toward adventure. You imagine yourself as Laura, the middle daughter, brave and curious and always asking questions. And then Miss Anderson reads the sentence. There were no people, only Indians lived there. You do not question it. You're 5 years old. You trust your teacher. You trust books. You absorb the sentence the way children absorb everything they are taught at this age, uncritically, completely, as simple fact. There were no people where the Ingalls family was going. Only Indians lived there. And since there were no people, only Indians, the natural conclusion your 5-year-old brain draws is that Indians are not people. You do not understand that this is racist. You do not have the vocabulary or the conceptual framework to recognize that you have just been taught to dehumanize an entire group of human beings. You only understand that the book has divided the world into two categories, people and Indians, and that these categories are separate and distinct and unequal. Miss Anderson continues reading. She does not pause at the sentence. She does not offer any clarification or context. She does not say, "Now children, of course the author doesn't really mean that Indians aren't people. She just means there were no white settlers yet." She reads straight through, because she is reading exactly what is printed on the page, and what is printed on the page is a sentence that explicitly denies indigenous people's humanity. The story continues. You hear about the long journey across the prairie, about building the log cabin, about the well Pa digs and the fireplace he constructs. You hear about Indians who come to visit the cabin, and the way Miss Anderson reads these passages, her voice drops lower, becomes more tense, more frightening. The Indians are described as bold and fierce and terrible, their eyes black and still and glittering. Ma is afraid of them. The neighbours talk about Indian uprisings. There is a constant sense of threat, of danger lurking just outside the cabin walls, and you absorb this too. You learn that Indians are scary, that they are dangerous, that white families like the Ingalls have good reason to fear them. You do not learn that the Ingalls family is living on land that belongs to the Osage Nation, that they are illegal squatters occupying territory guaranteed to indigenous peoples by federal treaty, that the Indians who visit their cabin are Osage people asserting their presence on their own land. You do not learn any of this because the book does not tell you, and Miss Anderson does not know it herself, or if she knows, she does not think it is relevant to the story. You are learning history through fiction, and the history you are learning is false. Not false in its details, necessarily. Laura Ingalls Wilder did live on the Kansas prairie, did experience the events she describes, did witness Osage people passing near her family's cabin, but false in its framing, in its perspective, in its moral logic. False, because it presents the story from the point of view of the colonizers and never acknowledges that colonization is what is happening. False, because it treats indigenous peoples as obstacles to progress rather than as human beings whose land is being stolen. False, because it makes you sympathize with the white family's fears while never asking you to consider what the Osage people felt, watching their territory being invaded by thousands of white squatters who had no legal right to be there. This is how racism is taught, not through explicit lessons in hatred, not through teachers standing at the front of the classroom saying, "Children, today we are going to learn why some people are inferior to others." Racism is taught through stories that present racist assumptions as natural, obvious, unquestionable. Through books that divide humanity into people and others, through narratives that make you identify with the colonizers and fear the colonized, through sentences that slip past your critical faculties because you are 5 years old and you do not yet have critical faculties, and by the time you develop them, the lessons you learned at 5 are so deeply embedded that you do not even recognize them as lessons. You think they are just facts, just the way things are, just the truth about history. You grow up reading the rest of the Little House series. You read about the long winter in Dakota Territory, about Laura's courtship with Almanzo, about the hard work and simple pleasures of pioneer life. You love these books. They become part of your childhood, part of how you understand American history, part of the stories you tell yourself about who you are and where you come from. And woven through all of these beloved stories is the thread of indigenous erasure, the constant implication that the land was empty before white settlers arrived, that Native Americans were peripheral figures in their own dispossession, that westward expansion was an adventure rather than a conquest. You do not question this. Why would you? The books are in the school library. Your teacher reads them aloud. Your parents give them to you for Christmas. Everyone agrees that Laura Ingalls Wilder is a wonderful author who wrote beautiful stories about pioneer life. And if the stories contain racism, if they teach you to see indigenous peoples as less than human, well, that is just how people thought back then. That is just the historical reality. That is just the way things were, except that is not quite true. Because even in Laura Ingalls Wilder's own time, Even in the 1870s, when she was a child living on Osage land, there were people who recognised that what was happening to indigenous nations was wrong. There were voices arguing that treaty rights should be honoured, that Native Americans were human beings who deserved justice, that westward expansion was built on theft and violence. Those voices existed. But Laura Ingalls Wilder did not include them in her books. She chose to tell a different story, a story that centred white settlers and marginalised indigenous peoples, a story that made colonisation seem natural and inevitable and even wholesome. And by the time you're an adult, by the time you have children of your own, and perhaps give them the Little House books to read because you loved them when you were young, the cycle continues. Another generation absorbs the same lessons. Another generation learns to see American history through the lens of pioneer mythology. Another generation fails to recognise that the empty land was never empty, that the fierce Indians were people defending their homes, that the little house on the prairie was built on stolen ground. This is the power of children's literature. It shapes how we see the world before we are old enough to question what we are being shown. It teaches us whose perspectives matter and whose can be ignored. It tells us which stories are worth telling and which should be forgotten. And when those stories contain racism, when they dehumanize entire groups of people, the damage they cause lasts for generations. But now you are sitting in a university library in 2014, and you have just opened a book that was not supposed to exist. The book is called Pioneer Girl, the Annotated Autobiography, and it is Laura Ingalls Wilder's original manuscript, the one she wrote in 1930 before she revised it into the children's novels that made her famous. This manuscript was rejected by every publisher she sent it to. It sat in archives for decades. And now, for the first time, you can read what Laura actually wrote before her daughter Rose, and the editors at Harper & Brothers convinced her to change it. You turn to the section about Kansas, about the time the Ingalls family lived on Osage land. You know the published version by heart. You have read Little House on the Prairie multiple times. You know the story of the log cabin, the wolf pack, the Indians who visit, the eventual departure when the government threatens to remove white squatters. But now you're going to see what Laura wrote before it was edited for children, before it was softened and sanitized and made suitable for publication. The first thing you notice is that the published version aged Laura up. In the books, Laura is depicted as perhaps 7 or 8 years old during the Kansas period, old enough to have clear memories and meaningful conversations. In reality, in the original manuscript, Laura acknowledges that she was only 2 to 4 years old when the family lived in Kansas. She could not possibly remember most of the events she describes in such detail. She's reconstructing her childhood from family stories, from things her parents told her years later, from her own imagination filling in gaps in her memory. This matters, because it means that when Laura writes about Indians in Little House on the Prairie, she's not recording a child's innocent perceptions. She's an adult woman in her 60s making conscious choices about how to depict indigenous peoples, what language to use, what incidents to include, what message to send. Every racist sentence in that book reflects Laura's adult worldview in the 1930s, not her childish misunderstandings in the 1870s. You continue reading. You reach the passages about Osage people visiting the cabin, and you see that the published version actually softened what Laura originally wrote. In Pioneer Girl, the descriptions are harsher. Laura writes about Osage men entering the cabin and taking cornbread without asking, and she frames this as theft, as frightening aggression, without ever acknowledging that these men had every right to the food because the Ingalls family was squatting on Osage land, eating crops grown on Osage territory, living in a cabin built on ground that did not belong to them. You see Laura's description of Osage physical appearance, and even in the published version that went through editorial review, the language is dehumanizing. The Osage men are described with bold and fierce and terrible faces. Their eyes are black and still and glittering. They move silently, speak in guttural tones, smell of skunk grease. Every detail is chosen to make them seem alien, threatening, less than fully human. And in the original manuscript before editing, these descriptions were even more extreme. You read the passage where Laura describes her mother Caroline's reaction to Osage visitors, and you see the line that appears in the published book, the line that has become infamous among scholars who study racism in children's literature. A neighbour, Mrs. Scott, says, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." In the published version, Pa contradicts this statement, defending Indians as people who have been wronged by the government. But you notice that Pa's defence is weak, paternalistic, more concerned with abstract justice than with actual Indigenous peoples. And you notice that nowhere in the book does Laura, as author, explicitly reject Mrs. Scott's genocidal statement. She puts it in a neighbour's mouth rather than her mother's, but she does not condemn it. She simply reports it as one of the views that existed on the frontier, as if saying that an entire group of people should be exterminated is just an opinion, a perspective, something that reasonable people might have believed at the time. And then you find the passage that was cut entirely from the published version. In the original manuscript, Laura describes an incident where white settlers talk about the possibility of an Indian uprising, where they discuss what they would do if Indians attacked, where they fantasize about violence, about defending their land against the people who actually owned it. The language is explicit. The hatred is undisguised. And the editors at Harper & Brothers looked at this passage and decided it was too much, too revealing of the violence that underpinned white settlement, too likely to make readers uncomfortable with the Ingalls family's presence on Osage land. So they cut it. They removed the most explicit expressions of racism and violence, and in doing so, they created a sanitized version of Laura's story that was palatable to Depression-era readers looking for comforting narratives about pioneer family life. They made the Ingalls family seem more innocent, more sympathetic, more worthy of readers' identification and admiration. They erased the evidence that white settlers were willing to kill Indigenous peoples to secure land they had no right to claim. But the erasure was incomplete, because even after editing, even after softening and sanitizing, the published Little House books still contain racism, still deny Indigenous humanity, still frame westward expansion from the colonizer's perspective without ever acknowledging what colonization meant for the people whose land was being taken. The editors removed the worst passages, but they left the underlying ideology intact. They cut the tree of racism back, but they did not pull it up by the roots. You close the Pioneer Girl manuscript, you sit back in your library chair, and you understand that you have just seen proof of something important. Laura Ingalls Wilder's racism was not accidental. It was not the product of innocent ignorance or childish misunderstanding. It was deliberate, conscious, central to how she understood and told her own story. And when publishers tried to make her books less racist, they succeeded only in making the racism less obvious, less explicit, more easily denied by readers who wanted to believe that the Little House series was just a wholesome tale of family life on the frontier. The truth is more complicated. The truth is that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote books that taught generations of American children to see Indigenous peoples as obstacles rather than human beings, as problems to be solved rather than nations with rights and sovereignty. And even when editors removed the most offensive passages, even when they softened the most extreme language, they could not remove the fundamental worldview that shaped every page. The worldview that said white settlers had the right to take Indigenous land, that Indigenous people's claims to their own territory were less important than white families' desires for new opportunities, that colonization was progress, expansion was destiny, and anyone who stood in the way of white settlement was an enemy to be feared and ultimately removed. This worldview saturates the Little House books. It is in the structure of the narrative, which centers white pioneers and marginalizes Indigenous peoples. It is in the language Laura chooses, which describes white families in loving detail while reducing Native Americans to threatening silhouettes. It is in the incidents she includes and the incidents she omits, in the questions she asks and the questions she never thinks to pose. And it is in that one sentence on page 3 of Little House on the Prairie, the sentence that declares there were no people, only Indians, the sentence that draws a line between humanity and Indigenous peoples and places Native Americans on the wrong side of that line. You're beginning to understand why this matters, why a single sentence in a children's book published in 1935 deserves hours of analysis and critique. because that sentence has been read by millions of children, because it has shaped how generations of Americans understand their own history, because it has taught people to accept the dispossession of indigenous nations as natural, inevitable, even wholesome, and because until we confront the racism in beloved texts like the Little House books, until we acknowledge what Laura Ingalls Wilder actually wrote and what her editors tried to hide, we cannot fully understand how American culture has perpetuated indigenous erasure and made genocide seem like manifest destiny. You're standing on the Osage Diminished Reserve in southeastern Kansas in August of 1869, and you need to understand something before we go any further. This land is not empty. This land is not available. This land is not yours for the taking, no matter what the white man standing next to you with his surveying equipment is telling you. No matter what rumours you heard back in Wisconsin about Kansas territory opening for homesteading, no matter what you want to believe about your right to claim 160 acres and build a future for your family, this land belongs to the Osage Nation, not belonged past tense, as if their ownership is a historical artefact that no longer matters. Belongs, present tense, right now, in this moment when you are standing here deciding whether to build a cabin or move on. The Osage people hold legal title to this territory through treaties signed with the United States government. The Treaty of Canville Trading Post, signed in 1865, specifically guaranteed this reserve to the Osage Nation in perpetuity. That means forever. That means the land is theirs and will remain theirs, and no white settler has any legal right to occupy it without Osage permission. But you are Charles Ingalls, and you are 33 years old, and you have been farming in Wisconsin for 12 years, and you have almost nothing to show for it. You have a wife and 3 daughters to feed. You have debts piling up. You have heard stories about Kansas, about rich soil and abundant game, and opportunities for men willing to work hard. And you have heard, from sources you trust or want to trust or desperately need to trust, that the government is about to open the Kansas Indian Territory for homesteading, that settlers who get there first will have their choice of the best land, that this is your chance to claim the future you have been chasing since you married Caroline. So you came here. You loaded your family into a covered wagon, and you drove south and west across Iowa and into Kansas, and you crossed into Indian Territory, even though the boundaries were clearly marked, even though you passed signs and landmarks that indicated you were entering restricted land, even though federal law explicitly prohibited white settlement in this area without government authorization. You crossed those boundaries because you chose to believe that the law was about to change, that your presence here would soon be legal, that you were not stealing land but simply arriving early to claim what would rightfully be yours once the territory opened. This is the lie that Charles Ingalls told himself. This is the lie that hundreds of other white squatters told themselves as they flooded onto the Osage Diminished Reserve in 1869 and 1870. This is the lie that made it possible for ordinary people who thought of themselves as honest and hard-working and faithful Christians, to commit what was essentially theft on a massive scale. They convinced themselves that the land was about to be available, that their illegal occupation was just a temporary technical violation that would be resolved in their favour, that the Osage people would be moved somewhere else soon, and therefore it did not really matter if white families started building cabins and ploughing fields before the official authorization came through. But you need to see this moment from the other side. You need to understand what the Osage people saw when they returned from their winter hunts in the spring of 1870 and found their lands occupied by white families who had no permission to be there. You are Osage and you are riding across your nation's territory in April of 1870, and you are coming home after months of hunting buffalo on the plains to the west, and you are expecting to return to the villages where your people have lived for generations, to the cornfields your women planted before the winter hunts, to the territory that was guaranteed to you by federal treaty as compensation for the millions of acres you were forced to cede in previous decades. But as you ride east, as you approach the familiar landscapes of your homeland, you begin to see smoke rising from places where there should be no smoke. You see wooden structures where there should be open prairie. You see ploughed fields cutting through land that your people used for hunting and gathering, and you realize with growing anger and despair that the white settlers have come again, that they have invaded your territory again, that the promises made by the government mean nothing again. You ride closer to one of these illegal settlements. You see a log cabin, recently built, with a man outside chopping wood. He looks up as you approach, and you see fear flash across his face. Good. He should be afraid. He's on your land without permission. He has built his home on territory that belongs to your nation. He has no right to be here, and he knows it, and his fear confirms his guilt. You could tell him to leave. You could burn his cabin. You could take his horses and his tools and his food as compensation for his illegal occupation of your land. Under Osage law, under any reasonable system of justice, you would be within your rights to do all of these things. This man is a thief. He has stolen your land. He deserves no mercy. But you do not burn his cabin. You do not take his horses. You ride past, watching him, letting him see that you know he does not belong here, that his presence is noticed and resented. You ride on to the next settlement, and the next, and the next, and everywhere you go you see the same thing. White families building cabins, ploughing fields, killing game, living on land that is not theirs. You return to your village and you tell the elders what you have seen. They are not surprised. They have heard reports from other hunters, other families, other witnesses to this invasion. The white settlers are flooding onto Osage land by the hundreds, perhaps by the thousands. They are claiming territory that was guaranteed to the Osage people by federal treaty. They are betting that the government will eventually legitimize their illegal occupation, that the treaties will be broken, that the Osage will be forced to cede their remaining lands and move somewhere else. And the terrible thing is, they are probably right. Because this has happened before. The Osage Nation once controlled territory from Missouri through Kansas and into Oklahoma, more than 100 million acres of land. Through successive treaties, under constant pressure from white settlers and the federal government, the Osage have ceded most of that territory. The Osage Diminished Reserve in Kansas is all that remains, a small fraction of your original homeland, and now even this reduced territory is being invaded, occupied, stolen. You know the pattern. You have seen it before. White settlers will occupy the land illegally. The government will make a show of enforcing the law, perhaps sending troops to threaten removal, but the political pressure from the settlers will be too great. Congress will pass a new law or negotiate a new treaty, and the land that was guaranteed to the Osage will be open to white homesteading. Your people will be forced to move again, to accept another reduced reservation, to watch as the promises made by the government are broken again. This is what happens in 1870 and 1871. Federal troops do come. They do order white settlers to leave Osage territory. Some settlers, including the Ingalls family, abandon their illegal claims and move away. But many others refuse to leave, and the government lacks the will to forcibly remove all the squatters. The political momentum is on the side of the white settlers. Congress wants to open Kansas to homesteading. The railroads want land to sell. The state government wants white population for economic development. And so, in 1870, the Osage are pressured into negotiating yet another treaty. They sell their remaining Kansas lands to the federal government for $1.25 per acre, far below market value. The government then sells the same land to white settlers for $2.50 per acre, pocketing the profit. The Osage are forced to relocate to a new reservation in Oklahoma, leaving behind the graves of their ancestors, the villages they built, the land they defended. Laura Ingalls. Wilder never mentioned him in the Little House books, not once. Not even a passing reference, not a footnote, not a single sentence acknowledging that he existed. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls, but the family called him Freddie. He was born in May of 1875 in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, during one of the worst periods of the family's life, and he died 9 months later, on August 27th, 1876, of convulsions and fever, and was buried in an unmarked grave in Wabasha County. You need to understand what this erasure means. Laura wrote 8 books about her childhood and early adulthood. She described in meticulous detail the foods her family ate, the clothes they wore, the songs they sang, the hardships they endured. She wrote about grasshopper plagues and blizzards and near starvation, and Mary's blindness. She wrote about losing crops and moving from place to place, and the constant struggle to survive on the frontier. But she never wrote about Freddie. She made a conscious choice to remove him from the narrative entirely. In Pioneer Girl, her original unpublished autobiography, she mentions him briefly. She writes about his birth and his death, but the passages are sparse, emotionally distant, stripped of the vivid detail that characterizes the rest of her writing. And when she and her daughter Rose revised the autobiography into the Little House novels, Freddie disappeared completely. The family's fourth child, the only son, the baby who died before his first birthday, was written out of existence. Why? Laura said later that the memories were too painful, that she could not write about Freddie without reliving the grief, that children's books should not contain such sadness. But you need to understand what this erasure does to the story she tells. It removes one of the most significant traumas of the Ingalls family's life. It eliminates evidence of just how precarious their existence was, how close they came to complete disaster, how many times they lost what mattered most. Carolyn Ingalls, Laura's mother, said near the end of her life that everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. Think about that statement. Everything would have been different. Not some things. Everything. Carolyn carried that loss for the rest of her life, and she believed it altered the entire trajectory of the family. But Laura chose not to tell you that. She chose to present a version of her childhood in which this devastating loss never happened. You are in Walnut Grove, Minnesota in the summer of 1876, and you are Caroline Ingalls, and you are holding your baby son, and you know he is dying. He has been sick for weeks. Convulsions rack his tiny body. Fever burns through him. You have done everything you know how to do. You have kept him cool with damp cloths. You have tried to get liquids into him. You have prayed. You have begged God to spare him. But you can feel him slipping away. Charles is working in the fields because the family needs money desperately. Mary and Laura and Carrie are trying to be quiet, trying not to disturb the baby, but you can see the fear in their eyes. They know something is terribly wrong. They have never seen their mother like this, hollow-eyed and exhausted, holding a baby who barely moves, who barely cries anymore because he does not have the strength even to cry. The doctor came yesterday. There is nothing he can do. This is 1876. Medical science cannot save a 9-month-old baby with convulsions and high fever. The doctor does not even know what is wrong. An infection, probably. Something in the baby's brain or blood. But the cause does not matter because there is no treatment, no cure, nothing anyone can do except wait and hope and pray. And on August 27th, in the late afternoon, when the summer heat lies heavy over Minnesota, and the grasshoppers that have destroyed the family's wheat crop for the 3rd consecutive year are still buzzing in the ruined fields, Freddie takes his last breath in your arms. You feel his small body go still, you feel the life leave him, and something inside you breaks that will never fully heal. Charles buries him the next day. There is no money for a proper headstone. The family marks the grave with a wooden cross that will rot and disappear within a few years. And then life has to continue because you have 3 daughters who still need to eat, who still need clothes, who still need you to be their mother even though part of you died with Freddie and was buried in that small grave. This is what Laura did not write about. This is the trauma she erased from the Little House books. And you need to understand that this erasure is not just about one baby's death. It is about how Laura chose to remember and represent her family's history. She wanted to tell a story of pioneer resilience and triumph, a story where hardships are overcome and family bonds are strengthened by adversity, a story where the Ingalls family faces challenges but ultimately prevails. But a story that includes Freddie's death is a different kind of story. It is a story about loss that cannot be recovered, about grief that does not resolve into triumph, about the random cruelty of a world where babies die for no good reason, and families are destroyed by forces completely beyond their control. That is not the story Laura wanted to tell. So she removed Freddie from the narrative entirely, and in doing so, she removed the evidence of just how close the Ingalls family came to complete collapse. Because Freddie's death was not an isolated tragedy. It happened during the worst period of the family's life in Minnesota. The grasshopper plagues had destroyed their crops for 3 consecutive years. Charles had invested everything in wheat farming, borrowing money to buy seed and equipment, betting that this year's harvest would finally allow the family to get ahead. And then the grasshoppers came, millions of them, darkening the sky, covering every surface, eating everything green. They ate the wheat down to bare stalks. They ate the vegetable garden. They ate the leaves off the trees. They even ate the wool off the sheep and the handles off the farm tools where human sweat had soaked into the wood. The family had almost no money. Charles took whatever work he could find, travelling east to work harvest on farms that had escaped the grasshopper devastation, leaving Caroline and the girls alone for weeks at a time. The family ate cornmeal mush and not much else. They wore patched clothes and shoes with holes in them. They accepted charity from neighbours who were only slightly less desperate than they were. And in the middle of all this, Freddie was born, and then Freddie got sick, and then Freddie died. And Caroline said, years later, that everything would have been different if he had lived. What did she mean? Perhaps she meant that Charles would not have fled Minnesota in disgrace, running from creditors in the middle of the night, abandoning debts he could not pay. Perhaps she meant that the family would have stayed and rebuilt, that having a son would have given Charles the motivation to keep trying. Perhaps she meant that her own grief was so profound that it altered her personality, made her more fearful and anxious, changed the emotional atmosphere of the family permanently. Whatever she meant, Laura chose not to explore it. She chose not to tell you about Freddie, or about the depth of despair the family experienced after his death. Instead, she jumped straight from the grasshopper plagues to the family's mysterious departure from Minnesota, never fully explaining why Charles abandoned the claim he had worked so hard to establish, never mentioning the debts he left behind, never acknowledging the creditors he deceived. You are Laura Ingalls Wilder in 1931, sitting at your desk at Rocky Ridge Farm in Missouri. And you're 64 years old, and you're writing your autobiography because you need money. The stock market crashed in 1929. The Great Depression is destroying rural America. Your apple farm is barely breaking even. Your investments have lost most of their value. You're facing the prospect of poverty in your old age, and you are terrified. So you are writing down the story of your childhood, trying to turn your memories into something that might sell. You have been encouraged by your daughter Rose, who is a successful writer, who has made a name for herself as a journalist and novelist, who knows how the publishing industry works. Rose thinks your pioneer stories could appeal to readers during the Depression, that people want narratives about self-reliance and family values and overcoming hardship through determination and faith. But you are struggling with what to include and what to leave out. You remember everything. You remember the hunger and the fear and the constant moving and the times when the family had nothing, absolutely nothing, and survival was not guaranteed. You remember Freddie. You remember holding him when he was healthy, when he smiled and reached for your face with his tiny hands. And you remember the terrible weeks when he was dying, when Ma barely slept, when the cabin was silent with dread, when you knew something awful was happening but you were too young to fully understand what death meant. And you cannot write it. You try. You write a few sentences about Freddie's birth and death, clinical and brief, stripped of emotion. But you cannot expand on it. You cannot describe what it felt like to lose him, what it did to your mother, what it meant for the family. The pain is still too raw, even 55 years later. So you keep it brief in the autobiography, a few mentions and nothing more. And when Rose reads your manuscript, when she begins the process of transforming your autobiography into publishable novels, she suggests cutting Freddie entirely. Children's books should not be too sad, she says. Readers want uplift, not tragedy. The narrative will be cleaner without him. The family structure will be simpler. The story will flow better from the big woods to the prairie to Minnesota to Dakota without the interruption of a baby brother who dies. You agree. You're relieved, actually, that Rose is making this decision so you do not have to. Freddie is removed from the story. The Little House books will feature 3 Ingalls daughters, Mary, Laura, Carrie, and later a 4th daughter, Grace, who was born after Freddie died. But the son, the lost baby, The child whose death Caroline said changed everything will not appear at all. This is how family trauma gets sanitized into mythology. This is how the messy, painful reality of lived experience gets smoothed into a clean narrative suitable for children's consumption. And this is how Laura Ingalls Wilder, with her daughter's encouragement and assistance, transformed her family's desperate poverty and multiple tragedies into a beloved series about pioneer resilience. But Rose Wilder Lane was not just an editor. She was not just helping her mother clean up grammar and structure prose. Rose was a political ideologue with a specific agenda, and she used Laura's stories to promote that agenda. By the time Rose began working on the Little House books in the early 1930s, she had become one of the founding intellectuals of American libertarianism, a political philosophy that emphasized individual freedom, minimal government, and free market capitalism. Rose believed that the pioneer experience proved the superiority of individualism over collective action. She believed that frontier families like the Ingalls' succeeded through self-reliance and hard work, without government assistance. She believed that the Little House stories could teach Depression-era readers that they did not need government programs like the New Deal, that they could overcome economic hardship the way the pioneers had, through determination and family unity and faith. This was, of course, a complete distortion of the actual historical reality. The Ingalls family did not succeed through pure self-reliance. They relied constantly on community assistance. They benefited from government programs, including homestead claims that gave them free land. They survived through luck as much as effort. Charles Ingalls was not a model of pioneer success. He was a chronic failure who moved his family from place to place, fleeing debts, abandoning claims, never quite establishing the prosperity he sought. But Rose did not want to tell that story. She wanted to tell a story that supported her political beliefs. So when she edited Laura's manuscript, she removed or minimized evidence of the family's dependence on others. She emphasized Charles's hard work and downplayed his failures. She presented the Ingalls family as a self-sufficient unit that needed nothing from anyone, that faced hardship with courage and overcame obstacles through determination. And she removed Freddie, because Freddie's death suggested that sometimes hard work and determination are not enough. Sometimes tragedy strikes, and there is nothing you can do about it. Sometimes babies die and crops fail and debts pile up and families fall apart despite everyone's best efforts. That reality did not fit Rose's narrative of pioneer triumph through self-reliance. So Freddie was erased. You need to understand the power dynamic in this collaboration. Laura was an elderly woman with limited formal education, writing for the first time at age 63, desperate for money, dependent on her daughter's expertise and connections in the publishing industry. Rose was an established professional writer with strong opinions about politics and narrative structure. Rose did not just edit Laura's prose, she rewrote entire sections. She restructured stories. She added dialogue and scenes that did not appear in Laura's original manuscript. She made decisions about what to include and what to exclude based on her own political agenda and her assessment of what would sell. Laura sometimes objected to Rose's changes. The archived letters between mother and daughter show tension, disagreements. Laura asking Rose to restore passages that Rose had cut, or to soften language that Rose had made harsher. But ultimately, Rose had the power in this relationship. She controlled access to publishers. She understood the market. She knew how to structure a book for commercial success. And Laura needed the money too badly to fight too hard. So Laura agreed to the changes. She let Rose remove Freddie. She let Rose reshape her memories into stories that supported Rose's libertarian ideology. She allowed her family's real experiences of poverty and failure and tragedy to be transformed into uplifting tales of pioneer success. And the result was a series of books that millions of people read as accurate historical autobiography, never knowing how much had been changed, removed, or invented. This matters because the Little House books became America's definitive cultural text about frontier life. They shaped how generations understood westward expansion, pioneer families, American self-reliance, and the role of government. Schools taught these books as history. Parents gave them to children as examples of American values. Politicians cited them as evidence that government assistance was unnecessary, that families could and should take care of themselves without public support. And all of this was based on a narrative that had been carefully edited to remove evidence of failure, dependence, and tragedy. The real Ingalls family, poor, struggling, traumatized by loss, dependent on community help and government programs, was hidden beneath the mythological version that Rose and Laura created for public consumption. Freddie's absence from the Little House books is not just about one baby's death. It is about the systematic erasure of historical reality in favour of comforting mythology. It is about how pain gets removed from public memory. It is about how complex truths get simplified into narratives that serve political agendas. And it is about how we teach children a version of history that obscures the real costs of frontier expansion, the real struggles of pioneer families, and the real role that luck and community and government assistance played in American westward settlement. You are reading By the Shores of Silver Lake, the fifth book in the Little House series, published in 1939, and you are learning how Mary Ingalls went blind. Laura describes it clearly. Mary had scarlet fever. The illness came with high fever and a distinctive rash. And after Mary recovered from the fever, her sight gradually faded until she could no longer see at all. The story is tragic and memorable. Scarlet fever was a well-known disease in the 19th century. Readers could understand what happened to Mary. They could picture the illness. They could grasp the terrible consequence. There is just one problem. Mary Ingalls did not have scarlet fever. Medical researchers proved this in 2013, more than 80 years after Laura published the story. They examined Laura's original autobiography, period medical records, epidemiological data, and Mary's symptoms as Laura herself described them, and they concluded that Mary almost certainly had viral meningoencephalitis, an inflammation of the brain and its surrounding membranes caused by a virus, not scarlet fever. You need to understand what this means. Laura Ingalls Wilder did not simply misremember the name of her sister's illness. She did not make an innocent mistake about a minor detail. She changed the diagnosis deliberately, or allowed her daughter Rose to change it, replacing the actual disease with a different one that would be more familiar and more dramatically resonant to readers. And this false diagnosis became accepted medical history. Doctors and medical historians cited the Little House books as evidence of scarlet fever causing blindness. Educators taught the connection between scarlet fever and vision loss, using Mary Ingalls as an example. Millions of readers absorbed this misinformation as fact. The truth only came out when researchers at the University of Michigan decided to investigate. They were pediatricians and medical historians who wondered whether the scarlet fever diagnosis made sense, given what Laura actually wrote about Mary's symptoms. They went back to Pioneer Girl, the unpublished autobiography, looking for the original description of Mary's illness before it was edited for publication, and what they found did not match scarlet fever at all. Laura's original description in Pioneer Girl states that Mary suffered a terrible headache and high fever. Her face became partially paralysed. The left side of her face was drawn out of shape. She had stroke-like symptoms. And then, gradually over weeks and months, her vision deteriorated until she was completely blind. These symptoms, severe headache, high fever, facial paralysis, gradual vision loss, are consistent with meningoencephalitis. They are not consistent with scarlet fever. Scarlet fever does cause a high fever and a rash, but it very rarely causes blindness. When scarlet fever does affect the eyes, it typically causes corneal damage that happens during the acute phase of the illness, not gradual vision loss over months. And scarlet fever does not cause facial paralysis or stroke-like symptoms. The disease that matches all of Mary's symptoms is viral meningoencephalitis, an inflammation of the brain tissue and meninges that can result from several different viruses. The researchers published their findings in Pediatrics, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. They presented their evidence methodically. They compared Mary's symptoms as described in Pioneer Girl against the known presentations of scarlet fever and meningoencephalitis. They examined whether scarlet fever could have caused the specific pattern of vision loss that Mary experienced. They looked at epidemiological records from Minnesota in 1879 to see whether there was a scarlet fever outbreak at the time Mary fell ill. And their conclusion was clear. Mary Ingalls did not have scarlet fever. She had viral meningoencephalitis. So why did Laura write that it was scarlet fever? The researchers offered several possible explanations. First, meningoencephalitis was not a diagnosis that ordinary people in the 1870s would have recognised. Doctors at the time often called it brain fever, a vague term that covered various neurological infections. Scarlet fever, on the other hand, was well known. Parents feared it. Everyone understood what it was. By attributing Mary's blindness to scarlet fever, Laura made the story more accessible to readers. Second, scarlet fever carried literary resonance. Beth March, in Little Women, dies of scarlet fever. Frankenstein's mother dies of scarlet fever. It was a disease that appeared frequently in 19th century literature, associated with tragedy and loss. Readers would have emotional associations with scarlet fever that they would not have with brain fever or meningoencephalitis. The change made the story more emotionally powerful. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Rose Wilder Lane was editing these manuscripts, and Rose understood narrative drama. She knew that readers needed to understand why Mary went blind. She knew that a clear, familiar diagnosis would be more satisfying than a vague reference to brain fever. She may have suggested the change to scarlet fever specifically because it would resonate with readers and create the emotional impact the story needed. But whatever the reason for the change, the result was that Laura Ingalls Wilder published a false medical diagnosis that became accepted as historical fact for more than 80 years. You are in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, in the early winter of 1878, and you are Laura Ingalls, and your sister Mary is sick in a way that terrifies you. This is not ordinary illness. This is not a cold or a stomach ailment, or even the fevers that periodically sweep through frontier communities. This is something else, something worse, something that has transformed your capable, confident older sister into a person you barely recognise. Mary's head hurts so badly that she cannot bear light or sound. She lies in the bedroom with the curtains drawn, a damp cloth over her eyes, moaning softly when the pain becomes unbearable. Ma has given her willow bark tea for the fever, but the fever will not break. It climbs higher and higher until Mary is burning to the touch, until she is delirious, speaking words that make no sense, calling out for people who are not there. And then you notice something that makes your stomach drop. The left side of Mary's face looks wrong. Her mouth is pulling to one side. Her eye is not closing properly. When she tries to speak, her words are slurred, as if she has lost control of the muscles in her face. Ma sees it too, and you watch the fear flash across Ma's face before she hides it, before she puts on the calm expression that means things are very bad, but she is going to pretend they are manageable. Pa rides to town to fetch the doctor. The doctor comes, examines Mary, takes her pulse, listens to her breathing, asks questions that Ma answers in a tight, controlled voice, and the doctor gives the diagnosis that people in 1878 give when they do not fully understand what is happening. He calls it brain fever, an inflammation of the brain, dangerous, potentially fatal. And if she survives, there may be lasting effects: seizures, paralysis, loss of mental faculties, vision problems. The family prays. You all pray, kneeling beside Mary's bed, asking God to spare her life. You make bargains with God the way children do, promising to be good forever if only Mary will get better. Pa reads from the Bible. Ma keeps vigil at Mary's bedside, spooning water into her mouth, changing the cloths on her forehead, watching for any sign of improvement or deterioration. And gradually, over days and then weeks, Mary does improve. The fever breaks. The delirium fades. The facial paralysis slowly resolves, though it leaves subtle asymmetries that will mark Mary's face for the rest of her life. She begins to eat again. She begins to sit up. She begins to talk normally. The family breathes with relief. Mary has survived. God has answered their prayers. But then you notice that Mary is having trouble with her vision. She squints at things. She asks you to bring objects closer. She complains that everything looks dim, as if she's seeing through fog. At first, everyone assumes this is temporary, a lingering effect of the fever that will resolve as Mary continues to recover. But the vision problems do not improve. They get worse. Over the following months, Mary's sight deteriorates steadily. She can see less and less. Colours fade. Shapes become indistinct. She begins to stumble over things she cannot see. She reaches for objects and misjudges the distance. And finally, by the time the family moves to Dakota Territory in 1879, Mary can no longer see at all. She is completely blind. No one understands why. The doctor has no explanation. Brain fever sometimes causes lasting problems, but total blindness is unusual. The family accepts it as God's will, as a trial they must bear, as a tragedy that has no clear cause and no possible cure. And Mary, who was planning to become a teacher, who loved to read, who was the responsible older sister who helped Ma with everything, must now learn to navigate a world without sight. You're Laura Ingalls Wilder in the mid-1930s, writing by the shores of Silver Lake with Rose's assistance. And you're deciding how to explain Mary's blindness to your readers. You remember the illness clearly. You remember the fever and the facial paralysis and the gradual loss of vision. You remember the doctor calling it brain fever. But you and Rose both know that brain fever is not a diagnosis that modern readers will understand or find satisfying. You need something clear and specific. You need a disease that readers will recognise, that will explain why Mary went blind, that will make sense in the context of frontier medicine. Rose suggests scarlet fever. It is a well-known childhood disease. It was common in the 1870s. It is associated with serious complications, and it appeared in other literature that readers would know. Little Women, for example, where Beth nearly dies of scarlet fever. You hesitate. You remember that Mary's illness did not look like the scarlet fever cases you saw in other children. There was no distinctive rash. The fever pattern was different. The facial paralysis was something you had never seen with scarlet fever. But Rose argues that readers need clarity, that brain fever will confuse them, that scarlet fever serves the narrative purpose without fundamentally changing the story. And you agree. You let Rose write the scarlet fever diagnosis into the book. You tell yourself that the specific name of the disease does not really matter, that what matters is conveying the tragedy of Mary's blindness, that readers do not need perfect medical accuracy in a children's novel. But it did matter. Because once the Little House books became famous, once they were read by millions and taught in schools and treated as accurate historical autobiography, the scarlet fever diagnosis became accepted fact. Medical textbooks referenced Mary Ingalls as an example of scarlet fever causing blindness. When doctors encountered patients with vision problems following scarlet fever, they cited the Mary Ingalls case. The false diagnosis entered medical literature as a documented historical example, and it stayed there for more than 80 years, from 1939, when By the Shores of Silver Lake was published, until 2013, when the University of Michigan researchers published their study in pediatrics. The medical community believed that Mary Ingalls had lost her sight due to scarlet fever. No one questioned it. Why would they? Laura Ingalls Wilder was Mary's sister. She was there when Mary got sick. She witnessed the illness firsthand. Surely she would know what disease her sister had. Except she did not. Or rather, she knew that the doctors called it brain fever, but she and Rose decided to call it scarlet fever instead because that made a better story. And in making that decision, they created a piece of misinformation that persisted for nearly a century. The 2013 study changed everything. When the researchers presented their evidence that Mary's symptoms were consistent with meningoencephalitis and inconsistent with scarlet fever, the medical community had to confront the fact that one of the most famous cases of scarlet fever-induced blindness was actually not scarlet fever at all. The case had been misdiagnosed, or rather, deliberately misrepresented, and generations of doctors and medical historians had accepted the misrepresentation as fact because it came from a trusted source. This matters for several reasons. First, it demonstrates the power of narrative to shape medical understanding. When a compelling story is told by a credible source, people believe it, even if the medical details do not quite add up. Second, it shows how literature can create false medical history that persists across generations. Third, it reveals yet another way in which Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane prioritise narrative effectiveness over factual accuracy. But there is something else you need to understand about this false diagnosis. It was not just about making the story more accessible, it was about protecting the family's reputation. Brain fever, or meningoencephalitis, was often associated with poor sanitation and contaminated water. It was a disease of poverty, of families living in conditions where sewage and drinking water might mix, where flies and mosquitoes spread disease, where crowded living quarters allowed viruses to spread rapidly. Scarlet fever, by contrast, was seen as more random, more unpredictable, something that could strike any family regardless of their living conditions. By changing the diagnosis from brain fever to scarlet fever, Laura and Rose shifted the narrative away from any suggestion that the Ingalls family's poverty and difficult living conditions might have contributed to Mary's illness. They made it seem like a tragedy that could have happened to anyone, rather than a disease that was more common among families living in desperate circumstances. This is part of the larger pattern in the Little House books. Laura and Rose consistently removed or minimised evidence of the family's poverty and the ways in which that poverty put them at risk. They wanted to present the Ingalls family as pioneers who succeeded through hard work and determination, not as people whose children suffered preventable illnesses because they were living in a dugout with contaminated water and inadequate sanitation. The medical records from the Iowa College for the Blind, where Mary attended school, list the cause of her blindness as brain fever, not scarlet fever. This is contemporary documentation from the 1880s, recorded when Mary enrolled in the school just a few years after she lost her sight. The school's administrators asked what had caused Mary's blindness, and the answer they received and recorded was brain fever. This is the diagnosis that the family gave at the time, before Laura wrote the Little House books, before Rose edited the story, before the need to create a compelling narrative for Depression-era readers. And this record, sitting in an archive in Iowa, proves that Laura knew the diagnosis was not scarlet fever. She knew the family had told Mary's school it was brain fever. She knew that was the contemporary understanding of what had happened. But when she wrote the books decades later, she changed it. She replaced brain fever with scarlet fever because it made a better story, because it would resonate with readers, because it removed the association with poverty and poor living conditions. And for 80 years, millions of readers believed the false diagnosis. They believed that Mary Ingalls went blind from scarlet fever. They cited her case in medical discussions. They taught it in schools. They absorbed it as historical fact. Until finally, in 2013, researchers looked closely at the actual symptoms Laura described and realised that the story America had been told for nearly a century was not medically accurate. This is how Laura Ingalls Wilder rewrote history, not just through what she left out, but through what she changed. You're standing in the Federal Land Office in Yankton, Dakota Territory, on August 21st, 1879, and you are about to commit a crime. Not a minor infraction, not a technicality, a federal crime. You're about to swear a false oath to an officer of the United States government in order to obtain land that you are not legally entitled to claim. And you are doing this because you are desperate, because you need land to build a future, because you believe that bending the rules is justified when the stakes are survival. Your name is Almanzo James Wilder. You were born on February 13th, 1857, which means that on this August day in 1879 you are 22 years old, not 21, 22. But the Homestead Act of 1862 requires that you be at least 21 years old to file a claim. And there is a problem. You need to file this claim now, today, before someone else stakes the land you have scouted. You cannot wait until next February when you turn 23, because by then the best land will be gone, so you are going to lie. You are going to swear under oath that you are 21 years old. You are going to sign a legal document that requires you to affirm your age, and you're going to write down a birth date that makes you exactly 21, not 22. You're going to commit perjury. You're going to defraud the federal government, and you are betting that no one will check, that no one will care, that thousands of other homesteaders are doing exactly the same thing, and the Land Office does not have the resources or the will to verify every claim. You need to understand what the Homestead Act was and why it created this situation. In 1862, during the Civil War, Congress passed a law that offered free land to anyone who would settle and improve it. The deal was simple. If you were a US citizen or intended to become one, if you were the head of a household, and if you were at least 21 years old, you could claim 160 acres of surveyed public land. You had to build a dwelling on it. You had to live there for at least 5 years. You had to cultivate a certain percentage of the acreage. And if you did all of that, the land became yours, completely free except for a small filing fee. This was an extraordinary offer. 160 acres of land, free. In the eastern states, land was expensive and mostly claimed. But in the territories west of the Mississippi, millions of acres of surveyed public land waited for settlers. The government wanted to populate these territories, to establish farming communities, to create economic development, to push westward expansion. And the Homestead Act was designed to make that happen by giving land to anyone willing to work it. But there were requirements. Age was one of them. You had to be 21. This was not arbitrary. 21 was the age of majority, the age at which you were considered a legal adult capable of entering into binding contracts. If you were younger than 21, the government considered you a minor, someone who could not be held fully accountable for legal obligations. And homesteading was a serious legal obligation. You were promising to improve the land, to live on it, to meet specific requirements. The government wanted adults making these promises, not teenagers who might abandon the claim on a whim. So the age requirement was firm, 21 or older, and Almanzo Wilder is 22. Which should not be a problem, except that for reasons that are not entirely clear from the historical record, Almanzo decides to claim he is 21, not 22. He swears to a false age, and this false age will follow him for the rest of his life, creating confusion in documents, requiring lies to be maintained across decades, forcing his wife Laura to juggle dates and ages in her books to avoid revealing the fraud. Why did he do it? The most likely explanation is that Almanzo had been working and living on the claim before he was legally old enough to file. He may have been 19 or 20 when he first arrived in Dakota Territory, too young to file a homestead claim, but old enough to work the land. So he lived on the claim informally, improving it, building on it, preparing it for the day when he could officially file. And when that day came, when he finally reached the age of majority, he may have decided to backdate his claim slightly to cover the time he had already been living there. Or perhaps he simply wanted to appear younger. Perhaps there was a social advantage to being 21 rather than 22, some reason related to his relationship with Laura or his standing in the community. Perhaps he thought that shaving a year off his age would make him seem more ambitious, more precocious, more impressive. Whatever the reason, he did it. He walked into the land office, he filled out the paperwork, he swore the oath, and he lied about his age. The document still exists. You can see it in the National Archives, in the Dakota Territory Homestead Records. The handwriting is clear. The date is August 21st, 1879. And the affidavit states that Almanzo J. Wilder was born in February of 1858, which would make him 21 years old at the time of filing, not 1857, which is his actual birth year. 1858, a difference of 1 year, a deliberate falsification. This matters because it is a federal crime. The Homestead Act required applicants to swear that all information provided was true and accurate. Lying on a homestead application was perjury, punishable by fines and imprisonment. The Land Office took false oaths seriously because homestead fraud was rampant. Speculators were filing false claims to accumulate land for resale. People were claiming they lived on their homesteads when they actually lived elsewhere. Fraud was so common that Congress eventually had to pass additional laws to combat it, requiring more documentation and stricter enforcement. Almanzo was never prosecuted. The land office either did not check his birth date or did not care about a 1-year discrepancy. Thousands of homestead claims were being filed every year. The clerks were overwhelmed. Minor age discrepancies were probably common and largely ignored as long as the applicant was clearly an adult. So, Almanzo got away with it. He obtained his claim. He built his house. He began farming. And then he met Laura Ingalls. Her family had moved to Dakota Territory in 1879, the same year Almanzo filed his fraudulent claim. Laura was 12 years old when they met. Almanzo was 22, though he was claiming to be 21. Over the next several years, as Laura grew into adolescence and then young adulthood, Almanzo courted her. By the time she was 17, they were engaged, and on August 25, 1885, they married. Laura was 18. Almanzo was 28, though according to his homestead documents he was 27. The age gap between them was 10 years. This was not unusual for the time. Men often married later than women on the frontier because they needed to establish farms and accumulate resources before they could support a family. Women married younger, often as teenagers, but the 10-year age gap, combined with Almanzo's false birth date on his legal documents, created a problem that would plague Laura when she wrote the Little House books decades later. Because if Laura told the truth about Almanzo's age, she would expose his fraud. She would have to explain why his homestead documents said he was born in 1858 when he was actually born in 1857. She would have to admit that her husband committed perjury to obtain his land. And in the 1930s and 40s, when the Little House books were being published, this would have been scandalous. Almanzo was still alive. He could theoretically still be prosecuted, though statutes of limitation had long since expired. But even more importantly, admitting the fraud would undermine the entire narrative that Laura and Rose were trying to create. The Little House books were about honest, hard-working pioneers who succeeded through legitimate effort. They were about families who followed the rules, who earned what they had, who embodied American values of integrity and self-reliance. A husband who committed federal fraud to get his land did not fit that narrative. It suggested desperation rather than determination. It suggested that the Wilders, like the Ingalls before them, were willing to break the law when it suited their purposes. So Laura changed the ages. In the Little House books, Almanzo's age is deliberately obscured and altered. In these happy golden years, which covers Laura and Almanzo's courtship and marriage, Laura never states Almanzo's exact age. She refers to him as being about 20 when they meet, when he was actually 25. She makes the age gap between them seem smaller than it was, and most importantly, she never mentions the homestead fraud at all. In fact, Laura goes further than simply omitting the fraud. She presents Almanzo's homestead claim as completely legitimate, earned through hard work and careful planning. She describes how he filed his claim properly, how he built his house according to homestead requirements, how he met all the legal obligations. She makes it seem as though everything was done correctly, above board, with no hint of deception or illegality. But you need to understand what this means. Laura was not just protecting Almanzo's reputation. She was not just avoiding an embarrassing family secret. She was perpetuating a false narrative about how Western settlement worked, because Almanzo's fraud was not unique. Homestead fraud was endemic. The system was designed in ways that encouraged fraud, that made it difficult to follow all the rules, that forced desperate people to choose between honesty and survival. The Homestead Act required you to be 21, but many young men arrived in the territories before they reached that age. They worked land they could not yet legally claim. And when they finally reached 21, some of them backdated their claims to cover the years they had already invested. Was this fraud? Technically, yes. Was it understandable? Also, yes. Was it fair to prosecute someone for claiming land a year early when they had already been living on it and improving it? The law said yes. Common sense said maybe not. This is the complexity that Laura removed from her narrative. She wanted to tell a simple story about honest pioneers, but the real story was much more complicated. You are Laura Ingalls Wilder in the 1940s, working on the final books in the Little House series, and you are trying to figure out how to handle the Almanzo age problem. You know his real birth date. You know what he swore on his homestead documents. You know there is a discrepancy, and you know that if you tell the truth, if you give his real age and the dates match up with his homestead claim, readers will be able to see that he lied to the federal government. Rose is helping you navigate this problem. Rose understands that the books cannot include anything that suggests Almanzo committed fraud. The entire Little House brand is built on the idea of honest, hard-working pioneers. Readers love these books because they present an idealized version of American frontier life, where families succeed through integrity and determination. A federal crime would shatter that image. So you and Rose decide to fudge the numbers. You make Almanzo's age vague. You avoid stating his birth date explicitly. You use phrases like, about 20 or a few years older than Laura, instead of giving specific ages. And when you describe his homestead claim, you present it as entirely legitimate, with no suggestion that anything improper occurred. This required careful editing. In real life, when Laura and Almanzo married, she was 18 and he was 28. That is a 10-year age gap. But in the books, the gap seems smaller because you have made Almanzo seem younger. Readers come away with the impression that Almanzo was perhaps 23 or 24 when he married 18-year-old Laura, which was much more socially acceptable than a 28-year-old man marrying a teenager. The deception worked. For decades, readers accepted the ages as presented in the books. No one checked Almanzo's homestead documents against his actual birth date. No one noticed the discrepancy. The fraud remained hidden, buried in archives that most people would never see, protected by Laura's careful editing of the timeline. But in 2014, when researchers published Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography with extensive historical annotations, the truth came out. The scholars who edited Laura's original manuscript cross-referenced all the dates and documents. They found Almanzo's homestead claim. They found his birth records. They noticed the 1-year discrepancy. And they published a footnote explaining that Almanzo had falsified his age on his homestead application. The revelation did not cause the scandal that Laura and Rose had feared. By 2014, Almanzo had been dead for 65 years. Homestead fraud was understood by historians as a common feature of Western settlement. No one was particularly shocked to learn that one more pioneer had bent the rules to get land. But the revelation did add another piece to the puzzle of how Laura Ingalls Wilder rewrote her family's history, because this is the pattern. With Freddie's death, Laura removed evidence of the family's tragedy and vulnerability. With Mary's blindness, she changed the diagnosis to avoid associations with poverty and poor sanitation. With the Osage land occupation, she presented her family's illegal settlement as innocent pioneering. And with Almanzo's fraud, she obscured the ages and omitted the crime to maintain the image of honest, law-abiding settlers. Each individual change might seem minor. A dead baby omitted because the memories are too painful. A disease diagnosis altered to make the story more accessible. Ages fudged to hide an old legal violation. But taken together, these changes represent a systematic rewriting of history. They transform a story of desperate people making questionable choices in difficult circumstances into a story of noble pioneers succeeding through hard work and integrity. And this rewritten history became America's understanding of the frontier. The Little House books were taught in schools. They were read by millions. They shaped how generations understood westward expansion, pioneer values, and American character. Children grew up believing that the frontier was settled by families like the Ingallses and the Wilders, honest people who followed the rules and earned what they had through legitimate effort. But the real frontier was messier than that. It was settled by people who often broke the rules, because following the rules was impossible or impractical. It was settled by people who lied about their ages, who squatted on land they had no right to claim, who fled from debts, who participated in the dispossession of indigenous peoples. It was settled by people who were not villains, but who were also not the idealized pioneers that Laura Ingalls Wilder presented in her books. Almanzo Wilder committed federal fraud to get his land. This is a fact. It is documented in the National Archives, and Laura Ingalls Wilder knew about it and chose to hide it when she wrote her books. She made that choice deliberately, in collaboration with Rose, because the truth did not fit the story they wanted to tell, and for more than 70 years, no one knew. The fraud stayed hidden. The false narrative persisted. Millions of readers believed they were reading true history, never knowing that the ages had been changed, the dates had been obscured, and a federal crime had been carefully edited out of the story. This is how mythology replaces history. This is how comfortable lies become accepted truth. You are Laura Ingalls Wilder, and it is August of 1888, and you are holding your newborn son, and you know he is dying. He has been alive for 12 days. 12 days of breathing and nursing and making the small sounds that newborns make. 12 days during which you allowed yourself to hope that maybe, finally, something would go right. And now he is slipping away, his tiny body racked with convulsions, his skin hot with fever, and there is nothing you can do except hold him and watch him die. You do not even have a name picked out yet. You were waiting. You were being cautious. You had seen too many babies die. Freddie, your little brother, and other infants in other families, babies who seemed healthy and then suddenly were not. You were afraid to name this child, afraid to get too attached, afraid to make plans for a future that might not happen. And now your caution seems prescient because this baby is dying, and you will never get to call him by a name, never get to watch him grow, never get to know who he would have become. Almanzo is useless. He is lying in the other room, barely able to move. He had diphtheria 2 months ago in June. The disease should have killed him. It nearly did. His throat swelled until he could barely breathe. The fever burned through him for days. The doctor said it was a miracle he survived. But surviving diphtheria is not the same as recovering from it. The disease has left him weak, exhausted, prone to sudden episodes where his heart races and his breathing becomes laboured. And then, in late July, something even worse happened. He had a stroke. You found him collapsed in the barn. One side of his face was drooping. His left arm hung limp. When he tried to speak, the words came out slurred and confused. You helped him back to the house, supporting most of his weight, terror coursing through you, because you thought he was dying right there, in your arms, in the yard. But he did not die. He stabilized. The facial drooping improved slightly. He regained some use of his arm. But he was left with permanent damage. His left side is weak. He has chronic pain. He cannot do the heavy farm work that homesteading requires. At 29 years old, he is partially disabled, and you are watching your newborn son die, and everything you have worked for is collapsing around you. The baby dies on August 12th, 1888. You do not name him. You cannot bear to. Almanzo makes a small wooden coffin. You wrap the baby in a blanket, and you bury him on the homestead claim, near the house, in soil that you and Almanzo broke and planted together when you still believed that hard work and determination could guarantee success. 4 months later, in December, your house burns down. You're not sure how the fire starts. A spark from the stove, perhaps. A lamp knocked over. It does not matter. Fire on the prairie spreads fast. The wooden house that Almanzo built, the house where you gave birth to Rose and to the unnamed baby who died, the house that represents everything you and Almanzo have invested in this claim, burns to the ground in less than an hour. You manage to save some clothes and a few dishes. Everything else is destroyed. The furniture Almanzo made, the quilts your mother gave you, the books you treasured. All of it gone, consumed by flames, reduced to ashes and charred wood. You stand in the snow holding 3-year-old Rose, watching the fire burn itself out, and you understand that you have lost. You have been beaten. The frontier has defeated you. Diphtheria, stroke, infant death, fire. It is too much. No amount of hard work or determination or faith can overcome this cascade of disasters. You are 21 years old. Your husband is disabled. Your infant son is dead. Your house is destroyed. And you have no money, no resources, no way to rebuild. This is the year that Laura Ingalls Wilder almost never wrote about. In the first 4 years, a posthumously published manuscript that was found after her death, she mentions some of these events briefly. She acknowledges the diphtheria and the stroke and the fire. But the descriptions are sparse, emotionally distant, stripped of the vivid detail that characterizes her other writing. and the baby who died is mentioned only in passing, a single sentence, a loss noted but not explored. There is no name, no description of what it felt like to hold him as he died, no acknowledgement of how his death compounded the other disasters to create a psychological breaking point. And in the main Little House series, the series that millions of people read, these events do not appear at all. The series ends with these happy golden years, published in 1943, which concludes with Laura and Almanzo's marriage and their first year of farming. The book ends on a note of hope and optimism. Laura and Almanzo are building their life together. They are young and in love and full of plans for the future. The last line of the book is Laura saying, "Our happy life together has just begun." Except that is not how the story continued. The happy life that Laura describes at the end of these happy golden years lasted less than 3 years before it was destroyed by disease and death and fire. The optimistic ending that millions of readers absorbed as the conclusion of Laura's story was a lie by omission. Laura stopped the narrative before the disasters, creating the impression that her marriage to Almanzor was the beginning of a successful partnership, when in reality it was the beginning of a catastrophic period that nearly destroyed both of them. Why did she stop the story there? The obvious answer is that happy endings sell better than tragic ones. Readers wanted to close the book feeling satisfied, believing that Laura's pioneer childhood prepared her for a successful adult life, that her hard work and determination paid off. An ending that included diphtheria, stroke, infant death, and fire would have been too bleak, too discouraging, too honest about the reality of frontier life. But there is another reason, a deeper one. Laura could not write about this period without confronting the extent of her failure. Because everything that happened in 1888 was, in a sense, a refutation of the ideology that she and Rose were promoting through the Little House books. The books argued that hard work and self-reliance led to success, that pioneers who followed the right values, who were honest and determined and faithful, would prosper, that the frontier rewarded virtue. But Laura and Almanzo did work hard. They were honest. They were determined. They did everything the pioneer mythology said they should do, and they were destroyed anyway. Not because they made mistakes or were lazy or lacked faith, but because diphtheria is a disease that does not care about your work ethic, because strokes happen to young people sometimes, because babies die for no reason, because fires consume houses no matter how carefully you tend them. These disasters reveal the truth that the Little House books worked so hard to obscure, that success on the frontier was as much about luck as effort, that you could do everything right and still lose everything, that the pioneer mythology of self-reliance was a comforting fiction that collapsed in the face of random catastrophe. So Laura ended the published series before the catastrophe. She stopped the story at the point where the mythology was still intact, where belief in hard work and determination had not yet been proven insufficient. And the first 4 years, which she did write about the disasters, remained unpublished during her lifetime. It was found in a drawer after she died in 1957 and was published in 1971, 14 years after her death, when she could no longer control the narrative. Even in the first 4 years, the disasters are presented with emotional restraint. Laura describes the diphtheria in clinical terms. The stroke is mentioned but not dwelt upon. The fire is recounted as a simple statement of fact, and the baby's death is given a single paragraph, almost as an afterthought, as if it were a minor incident rather than a devastating loss. You are Rose Wilder Lane in 1943, and your mother has just finished writing these happy golden years, and you are reading the manuscript, and you are relieved that she stopped the story where she did. You know what came next. You were 3 years old when the fire happened. You remember fragments of it, the heat, the smoke, the confusion, your mother's arms around you, the smell of burning wood. You know about your brother who died. You know about your father's stroke and its lasting effects. You know that the happy ending your mother wrote is not really an ending at all, but a stopping point before the story became too dark to publish, and you approve of this choice. You're one of the architects of American libertarianism by this point. You have written books and essays arguing that government intervention is unnecessary, that individuals can and should take care of themselves, that the pioneer spirit of self-reliance is what made America great. Your mother's books are part of your political project. They are meant to demonstrate that frontier families succeeded without government help, that they solved their own problems through hard work and community cooperation. But if the books continued past 1885, past the happy wedding and the optimistic first year, into the catastrophic 1888, the message would be different. It would show that sometimes hard work is not enough, that sometimes individuals need help beyond what family and community can provide, that sometimes disaster strikes and self-reliance fails, and people need institutional support, government programs, social safety nets, collective resources to survive. This would undermine everything you have been arguing. Your libertarian ideology depends on the belief that individuals are capable of handling their own problems without government interference. The Little House books are evidence for that belief, proof that frontier families thrive through self-reliance. But the true story of 1888 is evidence against that belief. It is proof that self-reliance has limits, that catastrophe can overwhelm individual effort, that sometimes people need help that only collective institutions can provide. So you are glad your mother stopped the story at the wedding. You encourage her in this choice. You help her craft an ending that feels complete and satisfying, that suggests the future will be bright, that allows readers to close the book believing in the pioneer mythology that you have spent decades constructing. And the truth remains hidden for decades. Readers finish these happy golden years believing that Laura and Almanzo lived happily ever after. They teach the books in schools. They cite them as examples of American values. They use them to argue that people do not need government help, that self-reliance is sufficient, that the pioneer spirit should guide contemporary policy. But the Wilders did need help. After the fire, after the stroke, after the disasters of 1888, they could not rebuild on their own. They abandoned the Dakota homestead. They moved in with Almanzo's family for a time. They tried farming in Minnesota and failed. They moved to Florida, hoping the warmer climate would improve Almanzo's health, but they could not make a living there either. For years they drifted from place to place, poor and struggling, dependent on family assistance and community charity. Eventually in 1894, they scraped together enough money to buy a rough piece of land in Missouri. They called it Rocky Ridge Farm, and over the next 40 years they slowly, painfully, built a successful farm. But they did not do it alone. They received help from neighbours, they benefited from agricultural extension programs, they took advantage of farm credit programs, they participated in cooperative marketing associations, they used all the forms of community and government support that were available to struggling farmers in the early 20th century. And ironically, the money that finally gave them financial security came from the Little House books, which Laura wrote during the Great Depression, and which sold well, partly because they were promoted as anti-New Deal propaganda, as proof that Americans did not need government programs to survive hard times. The books that made the Wilders financially comfortable were books that argued against the kind of assistance that the Wilders themselves had needed and used. This is the central irony of Laura Ingalls Wilder's legacy. She wrote books promoting self-reliance and arguing against government intervention. But her own life story, if told completely and honestly, demonstrated that self-reliance has limits, that disaster can overwhelm individual effort, that communities and institutions, and yes, sometimes government programs, are necessary for survival. The unnamed baby who died in August of 1888 would have been 55 years old when These Happy Golden Years was published in 1943. If he had lived, he would have been a middle-aged man, perhaps with children of his own. But he did not live. He died at 12 days old, and his death was written out of the Little House series entirely, mentioned only in the posthumously published first 4 years, and even there given just a single paragraph. His grave is somewhere on the Dakota prairie. The exact location has been lost. When Laura and Almanzo abandoned the homestead, they left him behind. There is no marker, no stone, no way to find the place where that tiny coffin was buried. He exists now only as a footnote in historical research, as an unnamed infant in genealogical records. as a loss that Laura Ingalls Wilder acknowledged briefly and then deliberately forgot. This erasure is part of the larger pattern. Freddie, the brother who died in Minnesota, was erased completely from the published series. The unnamed baby who died in Dakota was erased completely from the published series. Mary's blindness was included, but the diagnosis was changed. Almanzo's fraud was hidden through age manipulation. The Osage dispossession was reframed as innocent pioneering. The financial disasters and dependencies were omitted or minimized. Each erasure individually might be justified. Too painful to write about. Not appropriate for children. Not relevant to the main narrative. But cumulatively, these erasures transform the story. They change a narrative of desperate people, surviving through luck and community assistance and questionable choices into a narrative of virtuous pioneers, succeeding through hard work and self-reliance. And this transformed narrative became the story that America told itself about its own history. The frontier was settled by families like the Ingalls and Wilders, honest and hard-working and independent. They did not need help. They did not depend on others. They certainly did not need government intervention. They succeeded on their own, through pioneer virtues, through the American character traits of determination and faith and self-reliance. Except they did not. The real frontier was settled by people who needed help constantly, who depended on community networks, who benefited from government land giveaways and infrastructure projects and agricultural programs, who often failed despite their best efforts, who lost children and homes and futures to disease and fire and economic forces beyond their control. But that true story was not the one that Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane chose to tell. They chose to tell a myth that served political purposes, a myth that made readers feel good about America's past, a myth that suggested contemporary Americans could solve their problems the way pioneers did, through self-reliance and determination, without government intervention. And the unnamed baby who died at 12 days old, whose grave is lost somewhere on the Dakota prairie, is part of the cost of that myth. He was real. His death was real. But he was written out of history because his existence complicated the narrative. You are Rose Wilder Lane, and it is 1930, and you're sitting at your desk in your apartment in New York City, and you have just read your mother's manuscript. All 200 pages of it. Handwritten, sprawling, disorganized, but full of stories. Stories about Wisconsin and Kansas and Minnesota and Dakota. Stories about poverty and hunger and fear and loss. Stories about a family that moved constantly, that never quite succeeded, that survived through luck as much as effort. And you're trying to figure out how to turn this raw, painful autobiography into something publishable, something that will sell, something that will resonate with Depression-era readers who are themselves struggling with poverty and displacement and the collapse of the American dream. You need these stories to work. You need them desperately, because you need money, and your mother needs money, and if you can transform her memories into successful books, you can solve both problems at once. But the manuscript as written will not work. It is too dark, too honest, too full of failure and tragedy and uncomfortable truths. Your mother has written about Freddie dying, about the family fleeing debts in the middle of the night, about living in squalid conditions next to a saloon in Iowa, about squatting on Osage land, about Almanzo's stroke and the baby who died and the house burning down. She has written the truth, or a version of it, and the truth is not publishable, so you are going to rewrite it. Not just edit for grammar and structure, though you will do that too, but fundamentally reshape it, change its meaning, transform it from a story about poverty and failure into a story about resilience and success. Remove the parts that do not fit the narrative you want to create. Emphasize the parts that support your emerging political philosophy, because by 1930, you have become a committed libertarian. You have been thinking and writing about political philosophy for years. You have studied economics. You have watched the federal government expand its power during and after World War I. And you have become convinced that government intervention in people's lives is fundamentally wrong, that individual liberty is the highest value, that people should be free to succeed or fail on their own without government interference. And now, in 1930, with the Great Depression devastating America, the political stakes have become even higher. President Hoover is being criticized for not doing enough to help struggling Americans. There are calls for the government to provide direct relief, to create jobs programs, to intervene in the economy to prevent complete collapse. And you believe, with absolute conviction, that this would be disastrous. You believe that government help destroys individual character, that relief programs create dependency, that Americans need to solve their problems themselves the way previous generations did. Your mother's stories can prove this. They can demonstrate that frontier families survived terrible hardships without government assistance, that they relied on their own efforts and family bonds and community cooperation, that self-reliance works, that it is the American way, that it is what made this country great, but only if you edit the stories correctly, only if you remove the evidence that contradicts this message. So you start cutting. Freddie, the baby brother who died, cut. Too sad, and also evidence that the family's poverty put children at risk. The debt flight from Iowa, cut. Evidence of failure, of Charles Ingalls' inability to manage money, of the family's desperate circumstances. The worst descriptions of hunger and deprivation, cut or softened. You want readers to see hardship, but hardship that is overcome, not hardship that destroys. The Osage land occupation is more complicated. Your mother wrote about it honestly, describing how the family knew they were on Indian land, how they feared being forced to leave, how they witnessed the Osage people being displaced. You cannot remove this entirely because it is too central to the Kansas story. But you can reframe it. You can make it seem more innocent. You can present Charles Ingalls as a man who believed the land would soon be legally available, not as a willing participant in indigenous dispossession. You can emphasize the family's fear of Indians without exploring why the Osage might have resented illegal settlers on their treaty-protected land. And that sentence, that terrible sentence that your mother wrote, there were no people, only Indians lived there. You read it, and part of you knows it is wrong. Part of you recognizes that this sentence explicitly denies indigenous humanity, but another part of you thinks it reflects the historical reality of how settlers viewed the situation, and readers in 1935 will not object to it. The sentence stays. You work on the manuscript for years, revising it 3 times. The first revision focuses on structure, organizing the chaotic memories into a coherent narrative. The second revision adds dialogue and scenes that make the story more vivid and immediate. The third revision removes or softens anything that might undermine the message of pioneer self-reliance. Your mother sees these revisions. She sometimes objects. But you have the power in this relationship. You are the professional writer. You understand publishing, and your mother needs the money too desperately to fight too hard. The first book, Little House in the Big Woods, is published in 1932. It is an immediate success. Readers love it. They love the descriptions of frontier life, the details about making butter and cheese and maple syrup, the sense of a simpler time when families worked together and were self-sufficient. The book sells well enough that Harper & Brothers wants more. So you and your mother continue the process, transforming her memories into a series of novels that will eventually span 8 books and cover Laura's life from early childhood through her marriage to Amonzo. And with each book, you refine the message. You emphasize self-reliance. You show the family overcoming obstacles through hard work and determination. You present government as incompetent or irrelevant. When Pa files his homestead claim, when the family deals with land office bureaucracy, the government is always portrayed as a distant, inefficient entity that pioneers must navigate around rather than rely upon. You remove evidence of government assistance, community charity, or dependency of any kind. By the time These Happy Golden Years is published in 1943, you have created something remarkable. Not just a successful book series, but a mythology, a complete reimagining of frontier life that supports your political philosophy perfectly. The Little House books have become proof that Americans can survive hardship without government help. that self-reliance is sufficient, that the New Deal programs Franklin Roosevelt has implemented are unnecessary and potentially harmful, and you use this platform explicitly. You're writing political essays and books alongside the Little House series. You're one of the 3 founding intellectuals of American libertarianism, along with Ayn Rand and Isabel Patterson. You're arguing in print and in lectures that individual liberty is threatened by expanding government power, that Americans need to return to the pioneer values of self-reliance and limited government. And you point to your mother's books as evidence that these values work, that they enabled previous generations to survive and thrive without government intervention. The irony, of course, is that your own family's story contradicts this message completely. Your grandfather, Charles Ingalls, benefited from government land giveaways under the Homestead Act. Your father, Almanzo, committed fraud to obtain his government-provided claim. Your parents received assistance from family and community repeatedly when their own efforts failed. Your mother's financial security ultimately came from book royalties, not from farming or pioneer self-reliance. And you yourself, the great advocate of individualism and limited government, were living off your mother's stories, rewriting her memories to serve your political agenda, profiting from a mythology that obscured the messy reality of how frontier families actually survived. But you do not acknowledge these contradictions. You cannot afford to. Your political project depends on the Little House books being read as accurate history, as genuine autobiography, as proof that pioneer values work. If readers knew how much you had edited and rewritten and removed, if they understood that the books were as much fiction as fact, the political message would be undermined. So you maintain the fiction. When people ask how much editorial work you did on the books, you minimize your role. You say you just helped your mother with grammar and structure. You let people believe that the books are essentially Laura's voice, Laura's memories, Laura's truth. You hide the extent of your intervention. You conceal the political agenda that shaped every editorial choice. And it works. The books are read as authentic autobiography for decades. They are taught in schools as accurate depictions of frontier life. They shape how millions of Americans understand their own history. They influence political debates about government programs and individual responsibility. They become cultural touchstones, beloved icons of American literature. Your mother dies in 1957 at age 90. She lives long enough to see her books become classics, to receive thousands of letters from readers who love her stories, to achieve financial security and literary fame. But she also lives long enough to see how the books have been weaponized politically, how they have been used to argue against the kind of government programs that helped many struggling families during the Depression, how her painful memories have been transformed into ideological propaganda. Did she understand what you had done? Did she recognize how much you had changed her stories? How you had removed the evidence of failure and dependency and replaced it with a narrative of triumph through self-reliance? The letters between you suggest she did, at least partially. She sometimes pushed back against your edits. She sometimes wanted to restore material you had cut. But she also needed the money and the success, and she trusted your judgment about what would sell. You die in 1968 at age 81, having achieved everything you set out to accomplish. You helped establish libertarianism as a major force in American political thought. You wrote influential books and essays arguing for individual liberty and against government power. And you transformed your mother's traumatic memories of poverty and failure into the most successful piece of libertarian propaganda ever written. A series of beloved children's books that taught generations of Americans that self-reliance is sufficient, that government help is unnecessary, that pioneer values should guide contemporary policy. The Little House books are your masterpiece. Not because they are accurate history. They are not. Not because they honestly represent frontier life. They do not. But because they are supremely effective mythology. They make readers believe in a version of American history that never quite existed. A version where individual effort is always rewarded, where families succeed through hard work alone, where government intervention is unnecessary and even harmful. You are a reader in 2025, and you have just learned everything that Laura Ingalls Wilder left out of her books and everything that Rose Wilder Lane changed. You know about Freddie, the baby brother who was completely erased from the published series. You know about the unnamed infant son who died at 12 days old. You know about Mary's blindness being caused by meningoencephalitis, not scarlet fever. You know about Almanzo's federal fraud on his homestead claim. You know about the illegal occupation of Osage land and the sentence that declared Indians were not people. You know about the debt flight and the disasters and the dependencies that were removed from the narrative, and you are trying to decide what to do with this knowledge, because the Little House books are still beloved. They are still read by millions of children. They are still taught in schools. They still shape how people understand American history and pioneer values. But now you know that they are not accurate autobiography. They are carefully edited mythology designed to support a particular political ideology. Does this mean the books should be banned, removed from schools, condemned as propaganda? That seems too extreme. The books have genuine literary merit. They are beautifully written. They contain valuable descriptions of 19th century daily life. They have brought joy to countless readers. The fact that they are not entirely accurate does not necessarily mean they are worthless, but it does mean they should not be taught as history. Students who read these books should understand that they are fictionalized accounts heavily edited for political purposes. They should learn about the material that was removed and why. They should be taught to question narratives that seem too clean, too triumphant, too perfectly aligned with particular ideological positions. They should understand that beloved cultural texts can be simultaneously valuable and misleading. And perhaps most importantly, they should learn about the real frontier. Not the mythological frontier of self-reliant pioneers succeeding through hard work alone, but the actual historical frontier where success depended on luck and community assistance and government programs, where many families failed despite their best efforts, where indigenous peoples were violently dispossessed of their lands, where the costs of westward expansion were borne disproportionately by those who were already marginalized. The real Laura Ingalls Wilder was not the heroine of a triumphant pioneer story. She was a woman who survived extraordinary hardship, who lost siblings and children, who faced poverty and displacement repeatedly, who depended on family and community support to survive, who eventually achieved financial security by writing books that obscured the reality of her own experiences. She was complicated, flawed, human, and her story, told honestly with all its pain and failure and dependency included, is far more valuable than the sanitized mythology that Rose created. The real Charles Ingalls was not the heroic pa who always provided for his family and never made mistakes. He was a man who moved his family constantly because he could not establish lasting success, who squatted on land that was not his, who fled from debts he could not pay, who made questionable choices that put his family at risk. He was also a loving father who played the fiddle and told stories and tried his best in difficult circumstances. Both things can be true. The real frontier was not an empty wilderness waiting to be settled by virtuous pioneers. It was a contested territory where indigenous nations fought to maintain their lands and sovereignty against overwhelming military and demographic pressure, where white settlers knowingly violated treaties and laws, where violence and dispossession were constant features of expansion. Acknowledging this does not mean condemning everyone who participated in westward expansion as evil. It means understanding the true costs of American territorial expansion and recognizing that the victims of that expansion were real people whose perspectives and experiences matter. The Little House books are an important part of American cultural history, but they should be understood as mythology, not history. As carefully constructed narrative designed to serve political purposes, not accurate autobiography. As one woman's attempt to make sense of her traumatic experiences by reshaping them into a story of triumph, assisted by a daughter who had her own ideological agenda. And now you have to decide. Will you continue to read the Little House books as simple, wholesome stories about pioneer life? Or will you read them with awareness of everything that was removed and changed and obscured? Will you teach them to children as accurate history? Or will you use them as opportunities to discuss how mythology gets constructed, how political ideology shapes storytelling, how beloved texts can be simultaneously valuable and misleading? Laura Ingalls, Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane made their choices about what to include and what to leave out, what to emphasize and what to minimize. They created a mythology that millions of people believed was history. They shaped American consciousness in ways that persist to this day. Now it is your turn to make a choice. What will you do with the truth? Will you let the comfortable mythology persist? Or will you insist on a more complicated, more honest, more complete understanding of American frontier history? The line that said Indians weren't people stayed in print for 17 years before anyone complained. How long will it take for the rest of the mythology to be questioned and revised? That depends on readers like you. Would you still teach the Little House books to children knowing what was left out? Or is the mythology too dangerous to preserve? Drop your answer in the comments.